Have you heard from your ex since the divorce? One of the women seated at the table asked Brooke, sipping wine from a beaded glass. The ladies were comfortably seated on the terrace of the Travelers' Inn. Brooke Puckett thought for a moment before replying, "No, since I kicked him out and handed him the divorce papers and restraining order, I haven't seen or heard from him. He tried to talk to the kids, but they ignored him after I explained what he had done to us." Allie, new to the group, wondered, was it a bad break? I feel like there's still a lot of pain in it. When did the divorce take place? A year ago. I fought him for a year. When he noticed the kids didn't want anything to do with him anymore, he just gave up, signed the papers, and left. But all in all, he's been gone for 2 years. Good riddance, Brooke said this with venom in her voice. Ellie's next question was obvious. Why did you do it? Divorced him, you mean? Because he cheated on me with his first love, Gemma Evans, a voice came from behind. Jake Vanham cheated? No, he didn't. He's not that complicated. As for cheating with me, I'd remember that. Don't you find it impossible? Absolutely impossible. I just think you're up to one of your dirty little games again, Mrs. Brooke Puckett. Brooke turned her head so quickly that the others thought her eyes popped out. She said, well, look what the cat brought. You've got nerves. Look who's talking. You started manipulating Jake when we were still together. Your lies caused us to break up, and you have the nerve to claim Jake cheated on you with me? When the hell? Gemma replied, 2 years ago, as you well know. If Brooke's voice had claws, blood would have dripped from Gemma. Oh no. If I'd had sex with Jake, I'd remember, wouldn't I? 2 years ago, I was 5,000 miles away in Edinburgh, Scotland, studying general linguistics and tutoring non-English students. And I can attest to that with more justification than you can attest to being here at the moment. I'm back for a week after a 3-year move across the pond, and before that, I taught high school on the other side of the country. Brooke turned white. This scenario was not what she had envisioned, and it was very bad news for her. If it wasn't Miss Evans, then who was your ex cheating on you with? Brooke cornered, bit her. He cheated on me, and I kicked him out. Gemma wasn't finished and replied, and I think in the process of tarring and feathering you made it so he couldn't live here anymore. I think even his parents were fooled by your antics. I, for one, don't believe for a second that he was fooled at all, but was only following you. Are these children his? I could ask, but I have to go. I have things to do, people to talk to. Jake's parents, for instance. Brooke went white again. Don't you dare. I'll make your life hell. Gemma looked coldly at the once gorgeous woman, smirked, and said, life hasn't been kind to you, has it? You need too much makeup to make yourself look presentable anyway. You shouldn't spread your feathers, you might get tar all over them. But I am obliged to pay a visit to your former in-laws and let them know that I have an alibi for the whole dastardly cheating incident. I bid you farewell. Gemma walked towards the exit and turned around one last time. Brooke, Jake didn't cheat, and I'm going to clear something up. Thank you for throwing him out. He'll be mine as soon as I find out where he is. About your threat, don't be ridiculous. I'm leaving tomorrow for a new job, never to return to this nest of vipers. Now go suck lemons. With those words, Gemma walked to her car and headed straight for the Vanham residence. The stately home was exactly as she remembered, 3 parking spaces by the gate. Just outside the gate were 2 giant coboba trees planted by Jake's great-grandparents when they married and built the house. A long, shady driveway led to the house and 3 wide granite steps to the door. Gemma got out of the car, opened the trunk to get her laptop, and walked to the door. She knocked and waited. The door opened, and Jake's grandfather appeared on the doorstep. Yes, young lady? Good afternoon, Mr. Vanham. I'm Gemma Evans. Do you remember me? It's been a long time. Yes, I remember you. Wasn't your name mentioned in connection with that trouble about Jake's marriage? Yes, sir. I am here to tell you that Jake could not have had an affair with me. I can prove that I was in Edinburgh at the time. The old man looked at Gemma with piercing eyes, weighing her words. Gemma felt as if her soul was exposed under that gaze. Finally, he said, "Call me Rufus Sr." He said it with a twinkle in his eyes. "Yes, it is very good and brave of you to come. My son and daughter-in-law are sure that Jake is the culprit." "Am I?" "No, he's not capable of such a thing." "May I ask why you want to prove his innocence?" Gemma had a strong suspicion that this man would recognize any lie coming from anyone, and that lying to this man would humiliate him and herself in his eyes. So she answered honestly, "Jake doesn't know it yet, but I'm going to be the next Mrs. Vanham. But first, I have to find him." "Do you happen to know where he is, Mr. Vanham?" The old man's eyes gleamed mischievously as he replied, "I'm not in touch with his parents or his brother and sister, and I promised him not to tell anyone that he's at St. Christopher's Crossing now and is doing fine at the university there. But I can't be wrong when I say that you are a beautiful woman and not a man. Now, that's our little secret. Don't spoil the fun." "No, sir. I'll let you in on another secret. I was offered a job at the same university, and I accepted. So I'll be sure to run into him." From somewhere in the back of the house came a voice, "Dad, who's there?" "Don't let them tell you what you heard." The old man grinned and turned to Gemma. "Do you know where the kitchen is?" Gemma nodded, but when she turned, she almost ran into Jake's mother. "You have guts," she shouted. "Ruin my son's marriage and then come into this house uninvited? Get out." Jake's grandfather immediately intervened and bellowed, "Anna, she is my guest, and I will hear her out. She claims to have been abroad during this whole sordid affair." Anna Vanham immediately deflated and looked at Gemma. "What? I don't believe you." Gemma picked up her laptop, smiled at the old man, and said, "I'll show you." An hour later, Gemma was looked at by a very upset mother and a very angry old man. "What now?" whispered Anna. Gemma decided to tell the truth again. "I don't know. I'll leave this pit tomorrow. Jake and I became fast friends and were on our way to becoming friends, if you can call it that. That was until Brooke came along." Gemma told her story of how she lost her friend and soulmate to Brooke. She didn't expand on her suspicions about the sudden pregnancy. It was up to Jake to do that if she could find him. Anna was appalled by the machinations of the mother of her grandchildren and decided that her husband, Jake Jr., should meet the woman too. She asked affectionately, "Would you like to stay for dinner, my dear? Also, I would like you to tell this tale of woe to Randall, my husband." Gemma politely declined, saying she had to get ready to travel to her new job. At the same time, she would not tell Anna where her new job was located. As Gemma said goodbye, Anna looked away for a moment. "Gemma, when or if you find Jake, let us know. It seems like we've been making bad decisions and mistreating him. I really want my youngest back." Gemma replied softly, "If or better yet, when I find him, I will pass on the message. But it is not in my authority to reveal his whereabouts. Jake disappeared for a reason, and it's obvious he doesn't want to be found." With those words, she walked to her car. Halfway there, she noticed a man approaching Jake's brother. It flashed through her mind. She looked at the man. The man was well past his age and had gotten fat. He walked like a gorilla, and he looked like one: rough cheeks, thick neck, broad shoulders, arms wide apart as if he could not put them parallel to his body as they should be, a prominent belly, small steps, two thick upper legs rubbing together, wheezing like an old steam engine. Rufus Vanham looked closely at the slender, dark-haired woman. The woman seemed familiar to him, but he couldn't locate her. "She needs bigger boobs. B-cups don't suit me. But what legs she has. I'd like to feel them wrapped around me." He walked into the house and met his grandfather. "Do we have a guest here?" I noticed that Broad walking toward the gate. Rufus Sr., keeping a blank expression on his face, replied, "Yes, it was an old friend of Jake who wanted to reconnect. But we don't know where he lives, do we? That worthless, cheating son of a young." Rufus said, thinking, "Put that on thick." I still need him out of the way and as far away as possible. In every way, he walked up the stairs and entered his apartment, specially created for him after his accident. In the house, Brooke, meanwhile, was reflecting on her life when the divorce took place. Jacob, better known as Jake, was 35 years old, and she was 2 years older. Their children were 16 and 15 years old. They were born within a year of each other. They didn't meet right away. Brooke spotted the 18-year-old when she was finishing a 10-kilometer swim. She didn't dignify him with a glance at first until that dark-haired girl came up to him and started helping him out of his wetsuit. That got her attention. Suddenly, he looked gorgeous. She watched the couple closely. The guy had reddish-brown cropped hair, green eyes, and an oval face with a well-defined nose over generous lips. Broad shoulders, long, strong arms with wide wrists and hands with long, thin fingers. Narrow hips and very muscular legs completed the picture. As the girl began to towel him dry and he raised his arms, she noticed how his muscles tensed. She later learned that Jake had the physique of a swimmer, lots of strong muscles under a thin layer of fat, thick enough to hide how strong he really was. That's when she decided she wanted him and started planning to make it happen. The fact that the girl was probably his girlfriend didn't deter her. It took Brooke 6 months to break through the shy man's barriers. As luck would have it, his girlfriend, who wasn't yet his girlfriend, was moving out of town, and it became much easier to manipulate the situation. Finally, Jake suggested that she meet his family for a monthly family barbecue. Brooke now knew that he was the youngest of 3 children and a late addition to the family. His brother was 6 years older, and his sister was 4 years older. At the barbecue, she looked at the 2 brothers in amazement. They were the same height, hair color, and about the same face, but that was where the similarities ended and the differences became obvious. Rufus outweighed Jake by at least 60 pounds, whereas Jake was elegantly built and didn't have too much noticeable muscle. His brother was built like a brick house with large, bulging muscles. Also, whereas Jake was a bit of a talker, taking his time to answer and speaking softly and measuredly, his brother was all hype, boom, and superficial communication. Rufus turned his attention to the pretty girl of his stupid younger brother. He despised the brat. He thought he was too smart to like him. He decided to give the young woman a little more attention, a little more love. It took Rufus 2 weeks, lots of gifts, and attention to get Brooke settled into a decent hotel. After a month, she realized she had missed her period. When she asked Rufus, he laughed in her face. "You should have taken the pill, you stupid," he told her. Eventually, the only men Brooke had dated were her first boyfriend and Rufus, but after Rufus, she decided she could easily handle Jake. 3 months later, Jake and Brooke were married in a small ceremony, and Brooke had been happy as a clam in her shell ever since. She had a caring husband and a bad boy as her lover. Jake was wonderful in bed and a good provider, and she had a lover on the side just for quick and dirty sessions of casual fornication. Rufus was so small, his SEC was so insignificant, and it was over so quickly that even his scent didn't linger. The fact that she didn't always come didn't bother her in the least. She enjoyed getting away with it. 13 years later, his lifestyle caught up with him, and trouble befell Rufus. The long and heavy use of muscle-enhancing substances had finally presented its bill, and the bill was steep, his heart. He had just collapsed at the gym and was lucky enough to have a nurse working out next to him. That one immediately started resuscitating him. He continued to do so until the ambulances arrived, and an automated ventilator was placed over Rufus. When doctors arrived at the hospital after a few quick tests, they concluded that he had a ruptured myocardium caused by prolonged and excessive use of anabolic steroids. He was immediately sent for surgery. Rufus was discharged from the hospital as a man in a different body. The pronounced musculature was gone, he was flabby and in very poor condition. He soon realized that he would need constant and long-term care. Over the course of several months, he began to groom Brooke. He belittled. Jake told Brooke that she shouldn't have to put up with financial constraints and demanded that Jake increase his income. She deserved better, and him playing the victim was exaggerating his suffering. Gradually, his campaign had an effect. Brooke began to change her behavior toward Jake, and not for the better. She began to pick on him. At first, minor domestic irritants were enough to set Brooke off. A little later, she wanted her own car because the old junk wasn't something she wanted to be seen in. Brooke didn't notice what she was doing to Jake. Then again, she'd never pushed him this hard or this far. She faltered when Jake just walked away in the middle of a prolonged tirade. The kids had already run out of the room, wondering aloud when their father would stop taking hits. "Come back," she shouted. "I'm not done with you yet. Come back, you hear me?" Jake simply walked into his small office, closed the door, and turned on his laptop. A few minutes later, Brooke walked into the office. Jake looked up and growled, "Get out of here." At that moment, Brooke realized that Jake had reached his limit, and if she kept pushing, he would retaliate. She, after being married to Jake for almost 15 years, never realized that he was one of those men who kept taking hits and stride. It was only when his fingers were on the edge of the ravine that he would step back and react. When that happened to these men, they would start fighting back and explode without any warning. Jake looked into the rift that Brooke had torn in his soul and realized it was too deep. He'd had enough. He needed to protect himself. Jake had always known that Rufus would inherit the family company. It was a successful company that supplied the aviation industry with specially designed parts when there was a need for an airplane to perform above a guaranteed safety level. Jake earned a doctorate in aeronautics and a master's degree in industrial design. His grandfather was preparing him for his role as a future CTO. That was until his father took over the company. He pushed Jake aside. Jake suspected his brother had a hand in it, but he didn't care. He already had more work than he could handle. When his father fired him on a technicality, he tried to get Jake to sign a document to keep him from working for the competition. Jake laughed out loud in his face, walked out, kissed his father's secretary, and sang the lyrics to Tommy by The Who, "I'm free. I'm free." And freedom tastes like reality, as he left the house. When a major competitor found out about Jake's layoff, they made him an offer he couldn't refuse. He grabbed it with both hands. He was now working 28 hours a week for the same paycheck as he had at his father's company. Working full-time, the benefits were much better too. Jake realized that his father and brother would want him out of the way and had expected it years ago. On his grandfather's advice, he started his own company and based it in Luxembourg. All of his freelance work went through this company. Most of the revenue went into an offshore internet account in one of the other tax havens in Europe. The other smaller portion went into his regular account. Brooke never asked where the extra money was coming from, just that Jake was moonlighting on the side to get the extra funds. Suddenly, this arrangement became very convenient. He changed his instructions so that all the money went into an offshore account. He had absolutely no intention of stopping his freelance work. It wasn't even legally possible. Contracts had to be reckoned with in his office. He decided that he needed to spend more time with his children and so stopped working those ungodly hours. The next morning, Jake was reading the paper on his tablet, washing it down with his customary cup of coffee when Brooke walked into the kitchen. "Where have you been all night? I've been waiting for you for about 5 minutes, and then you fell asleep. Cynicism doesn't suit you. Tell me everything. But before you drift off, I need to say a few words to you." Brooke swallowed the venomous reply. "Instead," she said, "Riley, really, the word is yours," Jake said. "You do realize that yesterday, I worked about 30 days of 15-hour days without a single day off. I did it just to meet your demands, and you keep asking for more. In all that time, I haven't seen the kids for more than 4 hours, and now that's going to change. I've returned all my freelance assignments to my clients. I now work 30 hours a week, no more. If you want more, get a job and work." He was quiet for a few seconds, and when Brooke started, he raised his hand. "I'm not done," he said. "I think your behavior towards me is horrible, and if you keep this up, we're going to get a divorce. The ball is in your court. I'm leaving, and for a change, I'm going to have breakfast that I didn't make myself." Jake walked out of the kitchen before Brooke could utter a word. She just stared at the door, sitting there with her mouth open. She had never seen Jake act like this before. She pulled out her cell phone and called Rufus. "Rufus, Jake is getting stubborn. I don't know how to deal with him anymore." Rufus grinned. "That's what I expected. I have a plan B." Jake was sitting at his desk when his secretary called to say he had a visitor. Surprised, he asked if he had any appointments for that day that he didn't know about. "No, sir," was the reply. But she said it was urgent. The elderly woman entered his office and asked him to introduce himself. She then handed him 2 sealed envelopes with the words, "I regret to inform you that you have already been served." The woman walked out shaking her head and said to the clerk, "Please look after him. This is very bad news indeed." Jake looked at the envelopes. For some reason, he felt relieved. It was all over. Now he had expected it, but it still hurt like hell. What he hadn't expected was a restraining order forbidding him from contacting his wife, children, and parents. What really shocked him was the notarized affidavit stating that he had a relationship with Gemma Evans. With great pain in his heart, he began the necessary processes. Of course, the bank accounts were blocked. He looked into his professional connections to see if there was a lawyer among them. There wasn't one, but one client had gone through the same ordeal as Jake and referred him to her attorney. Finally, he rented a small apartment, just enough for the immediate future. Back to the present, Brooke noticed Olivia and Brian discussing something. Their voices were quiet, but not so quiet that Brooke couldn't hear what they were talking about. It sounded like her son had a problem and wanted to talk to his father about it. Brooke interjected, "Why don't you talk to your Uncle Rufus about it?" Olivia mockingly replied, "What could that sweaty, fat pervert have to say that even remotely resembles a reasonable person?" Brooke was stunned and insulted by proxy. She bit her tongue to keep from telling them who the real father was. "What? He's your uncle, mind you. Yeah, not a bad uncle. He offered me money for showing my tits and said he'd reward me generously if I helped him ease his urges. And that's not what he asked for," her daughter replied with disgust. Brooke thought, "That's his own daughter, for crying out loud, and he knows it. If it's true what she's telling me, God help me." Many bodies were pulled out of the closet that night. Brooke had no choice but to conclude that Rufus was a pervert and a danger to her and her own children. The fact that nothing had happened was due to the fact that Jake had instilled self-esteem in the children. Now the serious problem was the fact that she would soon be dependent on Rufus for income and lifestyle. Jake was paying a huge amount of money for child support. Because of this, she had a relatively good situation and never failed to make payments. But it didn't last long. She found herself in a tight spot and was now starting to regret some of her decisions. "Leonard Dalry, it's finally a pleasure to meet you," Gemma Evans said. "And the feeling is mutual. I've heard a lot about you, and all have been positive. I look forward to working with you." Professor Daltrey told Gemma about the ups and downs of the university and his role within it. He also informed her that he is a widower and lives with his girlfriend. The affable interview ended with Professor Daltrey saying, "I have arranged temporary housing with my good friend Nathaniel Thompson. He lives on the St. Christopher Trail and has a guest house. Maybe you want something more comfortable? I suggest you check out the homes in St. Christopher's Woods. There are a few houses around the lake and a few parcels of land with building permits for university employees. Although, I can tell you that the best lot is already occupied by our part-time Emanu, Anise." The professor looked at him wistfully and continued, "Perhaps I'll hire you. This man does an excellent job with children who aren't very gifted or have behavioral or learning problems. We recently got a special learning center he helped design, so these kids can reach their full potential. I would love to have him as one of the teachers there. However, he is a very private person, contact with him is not welcome, and so far, he has declined my offers." Gemma had been exploring around St. Christopher's Wood. After 2 months of acclimatization, she decided that this was the place she wanted to stay for the long term and began looking for the right house. Nadia Thompson accompanied her. Suddenly, they came to a sign. It read land for sale, and below it, in smaller letters, the building permit had already been obtained. Gemma exclaimed, "What a beautiful place! I could live here. But who would design a house that would fit in with these surroundings, let alone build it?" Nadia grinned, "I know a man. He's becoming a good friend of ours, HEK, an aeronautical engineer and designer. You should see the house he designed for himself and is building himself. He's a bit of a recluse, but when he thaws out, he turns out to be very good company. I'm having him over for dinner on Friday. You'll be able to meet him if you want to, of course." "I'd love to," replied Gemma, cheerfully. Meanwhile, at the Vanham house, Grandpa Brooke asked in a thin voice, "Rufus Vanham, Senor?" He scrutinized the face of the woman sitting at his desk, the mother of his great-grandchildren, only born to the wrong man. He was a keen observer of human emotion and noticed she was very upset. "Yes, dear, what's the matter?" "Do you happen to know where Jake is?" asked Brooke uncertainly. "Honey, I'm not going to answer that question either affirmatively or negatively." "Why are you asking? Trouble in paradise?" The question caught Brooke off guard, and she almost whispered, "Yes," but swallowed her tongue in time. This reaction did not go unnoticed by the old man. "Time to chop the ask, for this lady," in a steely voice he continued, "Rufus has some very nasty character traits, don't you think? And his addiction to those steroids doesn't help at all." Brooke stammered, "I don't know what you mean, honestly." Rufus Sr. grinned, "Don't play games with me, young lady. I may be old, but I am far from decrepit, as my son and eldest grandson like to think. I know those two adorable children of yours don't have Jake's genes." "What? How dare you?" exclaimed Brooke. "Don't mess with me, young lady. I'm willing to put my entire fortune on the line. What color are your eyes?" "Blue, and Jake's green, and both your children brown." "There you go, it's almost genetically impossible. They look like they belong to Jake because Rufus and Jake looked like each other once too, but Rufus has brown eyes, and you spent a lot of time in his bed." Brooke felt the world crumble beneath her. She gripped the backs of the chairs until her fingers turned white. She tried to say something, but her tongue refused to obey. Grandpa was relentless. "You're on your own. You put yourself completely at the mercy of the wrong man. You let him manipulate you and your children, and now that the outcome was not what you expected, you want Jake back in the saddle. Whether or not I know where Jake is, I'm not going to help you. Now get out." When Brooke left, Rufus Sr. stood in front of the window for a long time, thinking, maybe it's time for me to write that long letter. The two women had become friends since Gemma had been boarding with the Thompson couple, but she had never been invited into their home until now. Waiting for an answer to her knock on the door, she looked around. She was a little nervous. The door opened. "Oh, hi, you must be Gemma. I'm Nathaniel, but everyone calls me Nathan. Only Nadia, when she gets mad at me, calls me Nathaniel. Come on in." Nadia is in the kitchen. Gemma was a little shocked when she saw the scar running down the handsome face. As he turned to walk her into the kitchen, she noticed that he was very trim but walked with a slight limp. What had happened to him? A warm welcome awaited her in the kitchen. Gemma introduced herself to Jacob, their young son, and then turned to Nadia. "This house and its surroundings are stunning. How did you find such a gem?" For a brief moment, Nadia's face lowered, and their whole story flashed through her mind. As she contemplated what to answer, it is a long and sad story, but you might say with a happy ending. I'll tell it to you sometime, but since it's Nathan's story, I need his blessing to tell it. It is not common knowledge. Only a few people know about it. All I can say for now is that Nathan wrested it from the hands of the local tyrants and destroyed them in the process. And Jacob is not mine, he belongs to Nathan and his first wife. He's divorced before he met you. No, he's a widower. But I am very happy to tell you that in 6 months, Jacob will no longer be an only child in this house. Gemma hugged Nadia, exclaiming, "That's wonderful news." She wanted to ask when the baby would be born, but Nathan interrupted her. "Gemma, let me introduce you to Jake." Gemma exclaimed without thinking. She ran up to him and hugged him. Jake didn't react in any way, only said, "Gemma, long time no see." Embarrassed, Gemma let him go. Nadia and Nathan looked at each other, and Nathan asked, "Do you two know each other?" Before Gemma could say anything, Jake answered, "We used to be friends." Gemma's happiness collapsed, and tears welled up in the corners of her eyes. This was not the happy reunion she had envisioned. She cried, "Jake, why are you acting so cold? Aren't you happy to see me? I missed you so much." Jake was surprised and even more confused. He looked at his hosts. Nathan only nodded and said, "We'd better get out of your way right away. You can use the study over there." Sitting in the study, Jake looked at his former and now very upset friend, Gemma. He said, "You told Brooke that you had sex with me while I was married to her. You even signed the affidavit. That was the end of my marriage. Why should I be happy to see you? Those lies hurt me deeply." It suddenly dawned on Gemma how deep the deception had gone. She resented the fact that Brooke had manipulated her in such a way to ruin Jake and Jake's image in the community where he lived. She sat up straight and said to Jake, with firm determination in her voice, "I want you to listen to me very carefully. Before coming here, I lived in Europe for 3 years. I would never have told her that. I heard Brooke bragging about it in the pub, and I told her off publicly right then and there. After that, I went to your parents to tell them where I'd been for the last 3 years. I talked to your grandfather too. We had a good long talk. He was the one who told me that you were doing well and that it was likely that I would meet you here. I didn't realize it would happen so soon, and I had already decided to go and look for you. I've missed you a lot, to be honest." Jake blushed. "But the affidavit, it's forged. And if you still have the original, someone's going to be in big trouble. Jake, I loved you. I still do. But I would never have gotten into bed with you when you were still a married man. I would never have done that to you. All this time, I've been thinking about you betraying me and wondering what I did to you to deserve it. So you believe me then? Of course. You've provided me with at least one verifiable fact with just a phone call to my grandfather. I think you can prove the others just as easily. Most importantly, you've never lied to me in the past, so yes, I believe you." Gemma felt relieved that hurdle had been overcome. The next was how to communicate her feelings to him, and would he reciprocate those feelings. She swallowed and gathered all her courage. "Can we kiss and make up?" At that, she pushed back her chair. Jake did the same, walked over to her, and hugged her, asking, "Can you forgive me for what?" asked Gemma indignantly. "You've been manipulated in the most horrible way. There is nothing to forgive." Jake wanted to kiss Gemma on the cheek, but Gemma quickly turned her head, and her lips met his. Putting her hand behind his head, she pulled him against her and quickly ran her tongue over his lips. She broke the kiss afterward, smiling broadly. Jake felt stunned. "Did you just kiss me? Did that really happen? Did you just kiss me?" he asked her. "Yes, I've wanted to ever since I found out you were no longer married to that harlot. I've already told Brooke that I have a claim on you. Just tell me when. I'm in too much of a hurry, but slow or fast, I'm coming for you." Jake pondered this, enjoying the way Gemma's supple body pressed against his. "You know I'm damaged goods, don't you? There's a reason I'm building my home in such a remote location. I can only do things slowly. I needed to heal first, and I never dared to face my demons. It's just too painful. Let me in. I'll be there for you always. I know you married that harlot because she was pregnant, otherwise, you'd be married to me. And worse, I've done a little math and wonder if it's your son. There's something very strange about that. Now it's time to join our hosts. One last piece of advice, if you'd like to take it, accept a job offer from Professor Daltrey. It will do you a lot of good." When they returned, Gemma said simply, "Problem solved." He's mine now, although he's not entirely sure of that yet. Nadia clapped her hands together happily. Great, that was a quick job. What's next? Gemma snuggled up to Jake and pulled him to her. She smiled and replied with deep happiness in her voice, I have plans. One has to do with retribution, one has to do with never letting that guy out of my sight again, and finally, who do I contact to get that piece of land we saw this afternoon? The dinner was a great success and fun. Gemma told anecdotes from the days when they were friends. After dinner, things got more serious and Gemma finally asked the hard question, Jake, did that harlot explain how she gave birth to a fully developed son after a pregnancy of 6.5 months? No, you forget that I was there and was so enthralled that I never realized it. In retrospect, I can say that was very foolish of me. But what are you implying, Nathan? Knowing from his own experience how overwhelming it can be to witness the birth of a child, Nathan replied softly that it may not be yours and that you've been set up. But they look like me, and they look like a brother and sister, there's no doubt about that. Both Jake cut the phrase short, afraid to voice his thoughts immediately. Two women crashed into him, hugging him and whispering quiet words in his ear. Jake pulled himself together and asked, What now? I need to know for sure. Nadia took his hand and asked, Can you think of a man who looks like you? Maybe a cousin? Gemma exclaimed, Rufus. It has to be him, Jake said. No, they don't even like each other. Nadia didn't argue. Or that was said so you wouldn't suspect them. I think there's only one way to find out, and that's an official paternity test. That means you need a great lawyer, and I know just the kind. Donna Marshall, she's not one of the best, but the best of the best. Nathan, can you give her a call? Brooke had fallen on hard times. 2 weeks after Jake's grandfather had explicitly told her that he wasn't going to help her find Jake, she still couldn't find a way out of the situation. She didn't want her children to never see Rufus again, but she still needed him, if only for the money he brought in. She was making dinner while the kids were doing their schoolwork when there was a knock on the door. She looked through the small window and saw a man and a woman standing on the other side of the door. She opened it and asked, Can I help you? The woman asked, Are you Mrs. Puckett, Mrs. Brooke Puckett, ex-wife of Mr. Jacob Randall Vanham? Yes, what's the matter? The man now answered, I have a warrant. We need to take DNA samples of your children. Failure to comply with this warrant will result in arrest. What? Who? Why do you need DNA samples from my children for a paternity test? The woman said simply, and in doing so knocked the ground out from under Brooke's feet. Brooke had always had a vague hope that children might be the only reason Jake would come back to her. The other very important reason was that Jake was paying a huge amount of child support. If he found out that the children were not his, the payments would immediately stop, and she would lose her comfortable lifestyle. Meanwhile, at the Vanham house, another pair of paramedics accompanied by a police officer knocked on the door of Rufus Van Dam's apartment. Rufus Sr. watched the whole thing, thinking it looked like Gemma had found Jake and Jake had figured it all out. Now, he was going to have hell to pay. Rufus Jr. had refused to cooperate and attacked a police officer. The obese man couldn't stand up to the young tough guy, and soon Rufus Sr. witnessed his grandson walk with a short and humiliating gait toward the police car. 2 weeks later, Jake, the results are in, shouted Gemma, walking through Jake's apartment. Gemma was dreading the results. It was going to be very difficult for Jake either way, and Gemma would have to work hard to support him. Jake and Gemma sat on the couch, and Jake read the document and the attached test results. When he finished, Gemma saw that he had turned white and was suddenly very worried. Jake, she asked, what's wrong? You look like you're having a heart attack. I'm not having a heart attack, but I'm going to have one. Both kids belong to Rufus, and both he and that cheating ex-wife are going to pay me back for everything they've done to me and more. Gemma pressed herself against Jake, trying to comfort him. He felt great around her, and she hoped it would be the same the other way around. Jake still didn't respond to her advances. They hugged sometimes, chastely pecking each other on the cheek, but nothing more. Gemma could already feel her cayenne beating against the back of her teeth. She looked at his face, and suddenly, Jake was looking at her again with a vulnerable and shy expression in his eyes. Gemma, please don't misunderstand me. I love you with all my heart, and I've been berating myself for letting Brooke drag me away when you weren't home. I know you need and want more than I can give at this moment. Please believe me when I say that these feelings are mutual. But before I give myself completely, I need to resolve this situation. And I promise, I will resolve it. I will resolve it the hard way. And I don't want you in the thick of it. Also, if we start now, I feel like you'll become a rebound, and that wouldn't be fair to you and your feelings for me. I can totally understand if you don't have the patience for all of this and want to be free. Just tell me, and we'll part without any hard feelings on my part. Relief came over Gemma like a cool shower after a hot and tiring day. She knew from the past how difficult it had been for this shy man to express his deepest emotions, and she acutely felt the deep love supporting those words. She gave herself a few seconds to savor these feelings, releasing her hand from behind Jake's back. Gemma drew his head down and kissed him like she'd never kissed a man before, softly, with a light touch of her tongue on his lips and with all the love she had to give to this gentle and beautiful man. 22222222222222222. Jake felt as if a 9-volt battery had been applied to his lips. He was shocked for several reasons at once. The first was obvious, and the second was that Gemma didn't want to take the way out he'd offered. She said softly, almost touching his lips, "Nonsense, Jake. No more excuses. You won't get rid of me that easily. Now that you've professed your love for me, you'll find me in the thick of things every second because I'll be there to support you and help you." Jake put his arms around Gemma, kissed the top of her head, thinking, "God, she smells so good," and whispered shyly, "Why don't you put off building the house until this mess is resolved, one way or another? You probably won't need it by then. I might as well modernize and expand my house to suit your wishes." Gemma was stunned. Had he really just offered to let her move in with him? She decided to ask, "Does that sound like an invitation to move in with you?" "It does. You've just committed yourself to me, and I want you to know that I'm just as committed to you. If you want a ring and the appropriate ceremony that goes with it, I'll agree. But to me, marriage is an empty phrase. If we tell each other we're a faithful couple for life and jump the broom, it's just as valid to me. Yes, I want the ring. I want a ring as the symbol that's always personified and all its simplicity. So, I want a small, simple, plain, ordinary, unadorned gold wedding ring. And I want you to have exactly the same. I'll bring the broom as soon as you pay your fee." That same week, Jake and Gemma sat in Donna Marshall's office while Jake explained that he wanted payback by napalm. Donna patiently explained that she was in no position to help. Jake needs a shark, or rather, a bull shark, one capable of navigating the murky waters and attacking unexpectedly and effectively. However, Donna knew someone, a co-worker of hers, who had been in a similar situation as him and despised those vermin who did it to others. Her promoter introduced him to her, and they have been referring clients to each other or working together on some cases ever since. Sometime later, Brooke was doing household chores and thinking about the fact that there was no response after the DNA tests. Cautiously, she began to hope that it would all go away. She had found a way to shield her children from Rufus's direct influence, and their grandfather had been very helpful after she had taken Rufus Sr. into her confidence. Rufus Jr. seemed to be afraid of Rufus Sr. ever since he was taken from the apartment by the police. Suddenly, her peace of mind was shattered by a heavy knock on the front door. She went and opened the door, and there stood Rufus, his face purple and his thick figure shaking and trembling. He shouted at her, "What is this?" waving a stack of crumpled documents in his hand. Brooke took a few steps back. "I don't know." "You tell me." Rufus shouted, "That brother is demanding a huge sum of money from me for raising my children, and to enforce those demands, he has confiscated all of my property." Brooke staggered into the house and sank into a chair. "Good God. Jake is awake and prowling now that he knows the kids aren't his. He's in for one hell of a payback if he goes after me too. I'm finished. Edmond Dantes would be a teddy bear compared to Jake. She became very scared as her luxurious lifestyle came to an end. Rufus Jr. was still ranting when there was another knock on the door. Brooke tried to ignore it, but the knocking grew more insistent. She took a deep breath, got up from her chair, and walked to the door. When she opened it, she saw a small man with a hat, round glasses, and a mustache, something reminiscent of Professor Calculus from The Adventures of Tintin. Behind him stood a woman with a video camera, whose flashing red light showed it was active. "Are you Mrs. Brooke Puckett?" he asked. When she answered in the affirmative, he handed her an envelope and said, "You have been served. Have a good day," and walked back to his waiting car. With terror in her heart, Brooke watched them go until the car disappeared around the corner. Only then did she step back, close the door, turn around, and walk back to her chair. The terror turned into a black, seething swirl. She opened the envelope, and her fear grew even worse as she looked at the documents. There were DNA tests proving that Jake wasn't the father of any of the children, but his brother was. The next documents were demands for reimbursement of the money she had received in child support, including interest, and other demands because she had made him think the children were his and lured him into marriage with false accusations. The total amount of claims was staggering. There was another from Gemma Evans for falsifying an affidavit and one for defamation. Brooke had been in a panic until Rufus told her that the company would cover all the costs. Since the cat was out of the bag, after all, she was the mother of his children, wasn't she? Later that night, Brooke attended a family dinner. Rufus Jr. began to explain that they had developed feelings for each other, and Brooke was now his girlfriend. He would take care of the kids after their lawyers beat back the ridiculous demands of his idiot brother. His grandfather intervened gently, "You need to get yourself a lawyer. The company isn't going to pay for your deception and your girlfriend's deception. Jake has already suffered enough at your hands." There was silence at the table. Jake's father exclaimed, "Why not? He has a right to defend himself against these ridiculous accusations, doesn't he? The company has very skillful lawyers to counter this slander." Rufus Sr. replied, "First of all, the accusations are not ridiculous, they are completely true. The children are from Rufus and Brooke, they have been cheating on Jake from the beginning. And it appears that Jake has DNA evidence that the children are not his but Rufus's. If that's the case, then Jake is right. Besides, the company has strict rules about fraternization, and you broke them all. So if the lawyers take the job, it won't be to fight Jake but to enforce the company rules that Rufus has been breaking for about as long as Jake has been married to Brooke." Rufus's father exploded, "You can't do that. I'm the CEO, not you." Rufus Sr. laughed softly and replied, "But I own 70% of this company. I am the chairman of the board of directors. The board of directors can override any decision the CEO makes. Therefore, our legal team will not be used for a lost battle with a lawsuit just to satisfy your ego." Rufus Jr. exploded with rage. He kicked his chair and left the room. Once in the hallway, he froze, trying to catch his breath. Rufus Sr. dropped his napkin, apologized, and followed his youngest out of the dining room. In the hallway, he almost pitted the wreckage of what had once been a man until he remembered what he had done to his brother. He walked past and said in a soft but unmistakable voice of venomous steel, "If I find out, I'll bury you so deep even the devil can't find you. Do you understand?" Rufus Jr. was soon stunned by the attack. His ego and arrogance soon asserted itself, and he growled back, "And how do you think you're going to accomplish that, old man? I have powerful friends too, you know. Just try it, and you'll realize that this old dog can still bite." With those words, Jake's grandfather walked over and patted the still breathing, heavily breathing man's back lightly. "Tisk, TSK. You've got to do something about this condition of yours, or you'll never grow old." In his apartment, he sat down at his desk, picked up his old and trusty roll, and looked up the phone number for the University of St. Christopher's. Crossing the next morning at breakfast, Rufus Sr. was besieged by his son, Randall, and Rufus Jr. to get him to let them use the company's legal advisors. After a long study of the documents, they realized that this legal battle was going to be expensive and the only way to win was to fight as long as possible in hopes that Jake would run out of money. Alas, the old man stuck to his opinion and even backed it up by saying, "If I get even a hint that you sought the advice of a lawyer working for the company, you'll be fired and out on the street before you realize what happened. This is a misuse of company assets, understand?" He bit both men on his way out of the dining room. At his desk, he called the university. "Good morning, this is Professor Venom. I'd like to speak with Professor Daltrey. If he can spare me some time, I would be very grateful." A few minutes later, he heard a familiar voice. "Rufus, old friend. I haven't heard your voice in a long time. How are you?" Rufus Sr. smiled but replied seriously, "Mentally, I'm fine. Physically, not so much. But more on that later. I need one favor that involves two people. Always, my friend. You supported me in that disreputable affair with that shorty blackmailing university students into turning and working to his bed. You always had my back. Now I can repay you in kind. I don't think you'll like that, Leon. I'm going to come to your house and try to steal 2 of your employees for my company. I don't have any other choice." "Which 2? "Jake Venom and Gemma Evans." "Oh," said Leon. "I understand your grandson, but Miss Evans?" "I had a chat with Miss Evans, and she told me that rumors had reached her about Jake's marriage and some foul play. She came to the house to rectify the situation and said she wanted to track down Jake since he was divorced. Judging by the commotion in my family, she found him, and I seriously believe they've already connected. You wouldn't be wrong. When are we going to see each other? I'm asking to make them available when you want to talk to them. Is it a 2-hour drive? I can be on my way within half an hour. I would like you to be present as well. Is that possible?" "I'll make it possible. You seem to be in a hurry." "Yes," Rufus Sr. replied simply. "I'll see you in a few hours." Later that day, Leon was shocked by the appearance of his old friend. He looked frail and tired, but his voice was strong, and his eyes still sparkled. Before Leon invited Jake and Gemma into his office, the older men had a tense conversation. Jake, Gemma, Leon, and Rufus Sr. sat in Leon's office. The reunion between Jake and his grandfather was bittersweet, regret that the reunion had taken so long, and happiness that they could hug each other again. There was no need for introduction. Rufus looked at Jake. "Would you like to come to my place and take over the—" A stunned Jake asked, "But Grandpa, why? What about Dad and Rufus?" Rufus smiled sadly and replied, "I am sick, and that sickness is progressing. I am now at the stage where I may not be able to stand up to this horrible couple who are now running and destroying my company. I know firsthand that you can lead a company. I've seen you in action." Jake looked shocked and grabbed Gemma's hand. "I don't know what to say. Why didn't you tell me?" "I have my reasons, Jake. But can you answer my question? Surely your girlfriend must be agreeable too. But I'm building a house here, a family home for both of us, Grandpa." Gemma raised her head and looked at Jake. "A family home? Who's talking about taking it slow now?" Jokingly, she interrupted him, "Do you want me to stop taking the pills?" Jake replied, "As soon as possible. I'd like to have a few kids of my own if you're willing to help me with that." Gemma jumped up from her chair and kissed Jake hard in front of the other 2 men. "I took my last pill last night. Is that answer enough for you?" Rufus's voice broke through the happy interlude. "Jake and Gemma, may I remind you that you are still in the company? Also, Jake, the company office is less than an hour away from here." Jake looked Gemma in the eye. Gemma nodded, signaling Jake's acceptance of Rufus's offer to run the company. Jake turned to his grandfather. "The question remains, what to do about my father and brother?" "Leave that to me," his grandfather replied. When you take over, they won't be able to give you any more trouble. You are not the only one who holds a grudge against them. When do you want me to take over? So, you're going to do that, run the company? That makes me so happy. Yes, Grandpa, we'll do it, but when I am at the end of my life. Soon, the symptoms will make themselves known, and the pain will become unmanageable. Because Leon witnessed his wife's horrible death, he and others have set up a small private clinic where end-of-life care will be facilitated. I plan to go there in about 10 days. I think shortly after that, Jake was silently pondering when Gemma asked, "But what's the whole cloak and dagger thing about?" I suspect Randall and Rufus will go to any lengths to preserve their way of life. Jake has already become a pain in Rufus's ass, and I've already had to threaten him because he wanted to use the company's law office to fight the lawsuits Jake initiated. Leon interjected, "We've developed a fight plan to protect you two from Randall and Rufus." He looked at his old friend and asked, "Shall I do the honors, or do you want to do it yourself, Rufus?" "You do it, I'm getting tired," Rufus replied. Once Rufus passes away, a message will be sent to some trusted managers in the company's office, workshop, and factory. They will put the entire company on lockdown. I will write a little software similar to the infamous ransomware that will allow this to happen. The employees will be sent home for the entire time, with full pay, of course. We've made provision for that. Jake and Gemma were stunned at the scale of it all. Jake asked, "What about us? What is our role in this?" "Of course, you will be informed too, but you must do nothing until the will is announced. That's when everything will be known, and you can take over the company. By then, Randall and Rufus will be the least of your worries." Jake's grandfather sighed tiredly. "We've already taken care of that." He raised his eyes to Jake and said, "I'll write you a letter explaining everything. In the meantime, it's best that you remain in the dark about everything that's going on." "Grandpa, will you let me visit you at the clinic?" asked Jake, with a tremor in his voice. "No, son, you'd better leave me alone. It won't be a pretty sight, and I want to be alone when I meet my maker. This is a farewell for us. One last question, please take care of your mother. She, like you, is an innocent bystander. I promise, Grandfather, we will take care of Mom." With that, they said goodbye, and a very emotional Jake headed home with Gemma in his arms. It took some time at Jake's apartment before Jake and Gemma were able to digest this sad news. After a while, Jake said with a deep sigh, "I'm going to miss the old man. He was like a father to me, much more than my father." He only had eyes for Rufus. The only response Gemma could give was to hug and kiss Jake, saying, "I know." 2 weeks later, Jake had just finished negotiating with a contractor to finish their home in the woods when the sad news came. Jake wanted to finish the house as soon as possible, and Nathan had recommended this contractor to him as fast, quality, and reliable. After deciding to stay together, Jake remodeled the house and expanded it significantly. It would now be a 5-bedroom home with 2 living rooms and everything that goes with it. The house would be heated by a deep geothermal system, and the power would come from solar panels and 2 wind turbines. Jake was sitting in front of the house with the sad news in his hands when Gemma arrived. She tried to comfort him, but she only partially succeeded. Jake said he felt like something had been cut off from him. The next day, the probate lawyer called him for the reading of the will. Jake drove with Gemma and was getting ready for what was in store for him when he noticed a black sedan following him. He quickly steered the car into the parking lot next to the mall and was about to get out when a black car pulled up next to them. A woman got out of the car and gestured for him to roll down the window. Jake did so without turning off the engine or pressing the gas pedal until the woman showed her ID. "Sir, we're with the FBI, and we want to protect you until this case is over. When you come to the reading, please act like you don't know we're here. Everything will be revealed during the reading according to Mr. Vanham's wishes." Jake entered the conference room, leaving Gemma in the waiting room, and found his father, mother, and Rufus Jr. already seated. Rufus Jr. grinned. "Look, the prodigal son has come to see if there is anything here for him." "Well, I'll make sure you don't get anything, you little rat." The lawyer interrupted him. Sir, behave yourself, or I'll have you thrown out. Understood? Rufus wanted to say something else, but the lawyer, this time very forcefully, said again, Sir, behave yourself. Next time, you can sit outside the building and wait for your family. Now, do you understand? And I demand an answer as to what you understand? Rufus muttered something, and the lawyer stepped forward again. I can't hear a word you're saying. Do you or do you not understand that the next time you violate house ethics, you will be removed from the premises? Randall moved to interrupt him, but a raised hand stopped him. He recognized a man who was not to be trifled with. Good. Now that the shenanigans are over with, we can get down to the official part. An image suddenly came over Jake. It was Gandalf the Wizard from Lord of the Rings. The lawyer was exactly that kind of man, friendly and gentle, but testy towards people who tried to provoke him. Suddenly, he would become tough, relentless, and eager to retaliate. Jake was brought back to reality when he heard his name called, just in time to hear what was read aloud. All of my property in this office is reserved for my only son, Jacob Randall Vanham, who will henceforth be my successor as chairman of the board of Vanham Aeronautical Industries. What did Grandpa mean by only son? It's Dad, isn't it? What's going on? Jake thought, puzzled. Jake's mother sat nonchalantly in her chair, her lips curving slightly in a smile, while Randall and Rufus exploded. Ed, I'm his son, and Rufus is my son. I'll tear you apart, you crook, roared Randall at the lawyer. The lawyer didn't even blink and pressed the button. A few seconds later, the door opened, and 4 men appeared. They looked like they could rip the arms off a gorilla without batting an eye and took up positions next to the enraged men. One of them growled to Randall, You're not going to make me hurt you, are you, Miss Randall? Immediately deflated, Randall slumped, but Rufus, who was not noted for his restraint, tried to pounce on Jake, shouting, I'll kill you, you bastard. The next moment, he was sitting up again, his face reflecting agony, and he was rubbing his thumb and wrist. Now that calm had been restored, the lawyer continued, My dear friend, Rufus predicted this little unpleasant scene. That is why I asked these gentlemen to be present to keep the peace. He looked at Randall and said, Mr. Vanham has genetic evidence that you are not his son. He divorced your mother for a reason. Therefore, Rufus Jr. is not his grandson. The lawyer waited a moment to let the message sink in, then went on inexorably, still looking at Randall. When he learned how you were treating your wife and that you were renting an apartment at the company's expense and having fun again at the company's expense with escort ladies, he proposed to your wife, and she gladly accepted. Your wife got pregnant by Jacob Randall Vanham. We have notarized affidavits and, again, genetic proof that the second son of Anna Vanham Hansen and Rufus Vanham is Jacob Randall Vanham. Randall looked like he was about to explode, and he did explode. He lashed out at his wife, You cheated on me. You're going to pay for this. I'll sell you to a Russian brothel. He shouted. The lawyer interrupted, gesturing for 2 men to immobilize Randall. At the same time, Rufus imitated a goldfish on land very well. The lawyer said to the men, Will you please admit this behavior and threats into evidence? Then, turning to Randall, he added, You will do nothing of the sort. We have evidence of grand embezzlement committed by you and your son. You stole approximately $6 million from the company to support your dissolute lifestyle, not counting the money you both stashed away in the Cayman Islands. In addition, you sold security-sensitive technology to rogue states and competitors, jeopardizing the safety of our country. The IRS and the FBI want to have an in-depth conversation with both of you about this, whether you like it or not. You're both going to help them with their investigation. He looked at the 4 men holding Randall and Rufus in their seats and said, Would you be so kind as to escort these men to the exit and turn them over to the authorities? Brooke waited outside. She saw Jake walking with a woman, Gemma, who kept her word as she saw Jake give her a masterly hug. Half an hour later, her world came crashing down as she saw Rufus and his father being let out, read their driver's licenses, and taken away in separate cars. What happened here? Brooke thought. After a few seconds, Panic overwhelmed her, and she clutched at one of the men escorting the father and son, handing them over to the police. "I can't tell you, ma'am. All I can tell you is that they are going to assist the authorities in their investigation, and it's going to take a long time," the man said. One of them explained, "Looks like they're wanted for fraud, embezzlement, industrial espionage, and transferring classified technology to sanctioned countries. I guess we won't see them again in the next 20 years. "Who will run Van Dam's Industries when they're gone?" asked Brooke, while the emptiness in her stomach grew deeper. "The other person, the one who came in with that snitch in his arms?" Suddenly, Brooke felt unreal. She didn't know what had happened in the office, but Jake had come out on top. The luxurious life and protection from Jake's lawsuit that Rufus had promised her had evaporated. Depressed, she walked to Rufus's car and found it unlocked, with the key fob lying on the center console. Distraught, she drove home. 1 month later, Brooke was on a tear. Her meager income wasn't enough to support a household, let alone the luxuries she had grown accustomed to in her former life, as she called it. Now, she had to find a plan on how to increase her income or reduce her expenses. Of particular concern were the children's school fees. The only way out she saw was to try to get Jake to take care of the children, which meant she'd have to pry him out of that harlot's arms again. In her time with Rufus, she'd partied a lot, drank a lot, at Rufus's insistence, and had considerable plastic surgery to tighten her belly, which had appeared after the birth of her 2 children. She had her breasts lifted and enlarged, had a facelift, and had her lips tinted. As a result, she had lost her natural look, which was what had attracted Jake. Now she looked like the singer Cher, but without the healthy glow. Brooke paid no attention to any of this and was sure she could replace that harlot Gemma without a problem. Early in the morning, Brooke was sitting in her car, parked so she could see who would be coming out of the house. If it was Jake, she would leave and come back another time, and if it was that harlot, she would wait a few minutes to make sure there was little chance of Gemma returning, and then go bang on the door and get her husband back. Suddenly, she saw a blue Nissan Rogue appear and disappear around the corner. In a flash, she checked her makeup one more time, waited 5 minutes, got out of the car, and walked to the front door. Brooke had heard that Jake had designed and partially built the house himself. She forced herself to take a good look so she knew what to praise. She could always encourage him to remodel the house to his liking. The house seemed to grow out of the hill, it perched at the top, and its facade faced north. The small front showed 2 large windows next to the door, covered by shutters. Brooke took a deep breath, pulled her shirt down a little to emphasize her cleavage, grabbed the door knocker, and released it. The knock rumbled through the house, and Brooke waited and waited. Just as she was about to turn around, the door opened silently, and Jake appeared. He looked her over, his face expressionless, but he said nothing, certainly not inviting her in. Finally, she said in a sultry voice, "Hi Jake, you look good. Life is treating you well, I see. Brooke, I've been waiting for you to call for some reason." "What do you want?" he replied. "I want us to talk." "Aren't you inviting me in?" Brooke asked. Jake sighed. "Let's get this over with once and for all," he thought. "Then come in," he replied tiredly. He led her into his office, which was closest to the door. He didn't want Brooke assessing the rest of the house. Jake guessed why she had come. Gesturing for her to sit down, he took the chair on the other side of the desk and said, "Okay, Brooke, talk. What do you want from me? Aren't you going to show me the rest of the house?" Brooke inquired. "No. Why would I? Now tell me why you're here, Jake. Don't you realize we belong together? We have a history and 2 children together. Now I need you to come back to me," Brooke pleaded. Jake looked at Brooke, a thought flashing through his mind. What's going on here? Is she going crazy? Out loud, he said, "We do have a history, but my recollection of that history is a hell of a lot different than yours. You must be out of your mind if you think you and I will ever get back together." Jake's answer didn't seem to bother Brooke in the least. "I admit I made a mistake, but there are still children to think about. I can't provide for them properly. They're not mine. I have conclusive evidence that they're from my half-brother. So why should I do this? You've raised them the longest, and you've done a very good job of it. Rufus has never been able to take proper care of them, Jake sighed and replied. Don't worry, I'll take care of them, only because my mother, their grandmother, asked me to. She begged me to take care of them so that you couldn't get your greedy hands on that money. I certainly don't want to improve your lifestyle. Brooke stammered. This was not at all how she had envisioned this conversation. Jake had always been amenable to her demands, and she had completely forgotten about what had happened before their divorce. Now she'd hit a wall. She wanted him to take care of her children and herself. She tried a different approach. Jake, she purred, I know I've hurt you, but it's all because of Rufus's influence. Now that he's out of the world, we can be very useful to each other. Think what I can do for you. I know tricks in bed that would blow your mind. Dump that frigid witch and come back to me. We could have a good life, the four of us, like a family should. Jake was silent for a few moments, and Brooke decided she had won the battle. However, it had the opposite effect on the man in front of her. You look and act like a prostitute. Our past makes me think I should avoid you at all times. I'm not going to touch you, even in a dangerous costume. As for your children, I've arranged housing in St. Christopher's Crossing since Olivia will be attending college there. Brian will be living with his grandmother until he goes to college there as well. You will not be able to properly care for him and provide housing for him, so I have taken care of that. However, you will not get a dime from me. In fact, you have an outstanding debt to me. Jake was silent for a moment, and Brooke was completely stunned by his outburst. Then he continued, if you try to resist, I will file a fraud and extortion report, telling the authorities that the children are not mine and that you ripped me off during the divorce because of it. Now get out. I'm done. As Jake fell silent, they both heard the door open. Gemma peeked out from around the corner, and Jake said, Come in, my visitor is about to leave. A radiant Gemma entered the room with a very noticeable potbelly. She walked almost impetuously over to Jake and kissed him on the cheek. She whispered quietly so Brooke wouldn't hear, my suspicions proved correct. There are two of them. When Jake's smile grew even wider, Brooke couldn't hold back any longer. You're pregnant, she cried out loudly when she saw that her and Jake's plans had gone awry. Gemma and Jake looked at each other, and Jake nodded almost imperceptibly. Gemma turned to Brooke and said, Yes. I'm pregnant. I'm going to give Jake his own children, the children he has deserved for so long. Now, I hear you're leaving. We need to make plans, remodel the kids' room. Suddenly, a quarter fell on Brooke. The kids? You mean Gemma's? Face lit up. Yes, I'm having twins. I'm 3 months pregnant. I got suspicious when my belly started bloating so early. The first echogram didn't show both fetuses because one was hiding behind the other. This echogram showed two, and their gender. She kissed Jake hard on the lips and whispered, Boys. Brooke said, You can't do this to me, abandon me to my fate, take my children, your niece and nephew. Jake decided it was time to drop all pretense of politeness and replied in a tone that Brooke knew all too well, but Gemma had yet to experience, I don't know who Olivia and Brian are to me. You tell me that, and keep in mind that Randall was not the biological son of Rufus Sr., and I am not Randall's biological son, but from Rufus Sr., we have the same mother, though since Randall and Rufus Jr. were arrested, Brooke has had no contact with them. Anna refused to get close and wanted nothing to do with her. It became clear to Brooke that she was truly isolated and on her own. She didn't have a decent job and lived in a rundown apartment for which she had to sell her valuables one at a time. She lowered her head and almost didn't notice that Jake had spoken again. If it were up to me, you could rot in hell, but my mother and Gemma are convinced that if I do that, you'll be a quivering, sick ruin of a human being. I'm okay with that, but they told me again that you're still the mother of your children and they might feel obligated to take care of you, and that would come at a cost. I don't want them to pay, so I found a job for you, simple physical work that will pay the rent and basic living expenses. Brooke had already applied for several jobs, but was rejected each time. She would have to look somewhere far away to find a job, and she wouldn't be able to see her children at all. Jake handed her a card with an address and phone number, and Gemma said, "This is your only chance to keep in touch with the kids because it's the only job for you after the lawsuits are heard by the judge. If you don't use it, we will take our hands off you, and we won't take your children." They've decided on their own that Olivia will live at St. Christ's Crossing and Brian will live with Anna. They understand perfectly well what you've done to the man they thought was their father. Now, Gemma gestured to Brooke that it was time to leave. In front of the door, she told Brooke, "In the end, I won. I have Jake, and I will have his children. Your selfishness ruined Jake. You bet on the wrong man for imaginary luxury. I have the best man, and you have nothing." Gemma cast a hard look at Brooke and continued, "I'm warning you, if you try anything with Jake, I will stand in your way. If you try to manipulate your children and try to turn them against him or hurt Jake in any way, I will come after you, and I will not stop until you are completely destroyed. Do you understand?" Brooke's mouth dropped open at the blatant threats and overt hostility that Gemma radiated. "Answer me. Do you understand?" "Yes, I understand. No direct contact with Jake, only through you." "Yes, now get out." Brooke, who a few hours ago had stood so confidently in front of the mirror, was no more. Her world had crumbled in the last 45 minutes. Brooke walked to her car. Inside, Gemma was nestled snugly in Jake's lap. She sighed. "You're mine. It took me almost 20 years to get here, but we're together again in spite of Brooke and thanks to her stupidity." After a moment, she rose to her feet and pulled Jake with her. "We need to practice." "Practice what for?" asked Jake. "Number 3, of course." And giggling, she pulled him into the bedroom. "Hi there. If you found these contents useful, don't hesitate to pass them along to your friends and family. Moreover, since YouTube's algorithm favors videos with numerous likes, if you've enjoyed this video, a simple click on the like button would greatly assist our podcast in reaching a broader audience. Subscribing to the channel for notifications whenever new content is uploaded is also highly recommended. YouTube will keep you informed accordingly. Many thanks for your support, and have a fantastic day.